Good afternoon and welcome to FCI's webinar series. I'm Samira Salem, FCI's Director of Social Innovation and Community Development. We're happy that you could join us today. We want to express our gratitude to BMO Harris for supporting this webinar series. As always, we welcome your questions and comments. So feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat box on your screen and submit them to us throughout the webinar. In addition, we're going to be recording this webinar and we'll make a link available afterwards so you can share with colleagues, friends, parents, grandparents, whomever you think might be interested. We're so pleased to have Dr. Kathy Kramer, the Director of the Morgridge Center for Public Service, Professor in the Department of Political Science at UW-Madison, and the nationally acclaimed author of The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin, and The Rise of Scott Walker. This is groundbreaking research examining rural consciousness and resentment in Wisconsin and how that interacts with politics in our state. Her work is highly significant and relevant, especially in the post-election era, where we're increasingly hearing about a rural-urban divide. It's important to get past the stereotypes we have of each other and understand where rural and urban communities are coming from and why. Kathy's research helps us to do just that. We want to welcome Kathy.
Thank you so much, Samira. It really is an honor to be doing this webinar. So thank you to you and to FCI. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with folks. So I'm looking forward to sharing what I know, and then we'll have a little bit of time for question and answers at the end. So please do type in your questions to Samira. So let's get started. The title of my talk is Understanding Rural Resentment Toward Cities. And yes, I'm going to be talking about divides between rural and urban people and places. And much of what I have to say is pretty sobering, but I think one thing to keep in mind is just the number of people who are logging in today and are concerned about these issues and trying to find things that they can do about them in their everyday lives. So there is hope in all of this for all of us. So without further ado, what I want to explain is that I am a public opinion scholar, which means I try to understand why people think and act the way they do about politics. And typically in the study of public opinion, a question comes up of, why do people vote against their interests? Why do they vote the way they do in a way that seems like they're not actually voting for the candidate or the party who's going to best improve their lives or promote policies that are going to improve their lives? But instead of asking what are people getting wrong, I like to ask a different question, which is, what are people getting? How are they understanding their world? In other words, I like to listen to how people are thinking about politics and talking about politics and try to get a sense of the types of things going through their mind when they make political choices. And over the course of my career, I've learned that the best way for me to study that is to listen to people talking to folks in their own lives, people that they know, people that they normally spend time with in the places that they normally hang out. So about 10 years ago, I started a study of how people interpret politics, how they make sense of politics, especially with respect to their own social class identity. I was really interested in how do people see where they sit in sort of the pecking order of things with respect to social class and how that matters for the way they think and act about politics. And I also wanted, honestly, a good excuse to get out and about around this state that I love. I grew up in Wisconsin. You can probably tell from my accent by now that I'm from somewhere close to here, if not from this state. And I decided that I was going to study how social class identity matters for how people interpret politics by using Wisconsin as a window. So I wasn't necessarily looking at Wisconsin, but I was using it as a place in which I could listen to people talk extensively. So what I did was to carve up the state into different regions, depending on political leanings, type of industry, type of agriculture, population density, different population characteristics, race and ethnicity. And then in each of these different regions in the state, I sampled several communities, typically typically a large place and a small place. And then I sampled some additional communities to give me a wide range of people across the states. This map in front of you right now just shows you a dot for each of the communities that I visited. There were 27 communities in all. So back in May of 2007, I had sampled these places and I wanted to find a group of people who got together on a regular basis that, again, I could just get access to, I could invite myself into. And so the study that I'm going to be telling you about took place between May of 2007 and November of 2012. And then in recent years, in 2016 and 2017, I've gone back to many of these groups. There were 39 groups in all across these 27 communities. But here's what I did more specifically. Once I had sampled a place, I called up a local newspaper office or one of our county University Wisconsin Extension offices, and I said, where in such and such Wisconsin do people go that I could get access to? Where do the regulars hang out? And they sent me to the following places. These are just a variety of pictures of some of the places that I spent time in. A lot of times people said, oh, you need to go to the diner on Main Street or such and such restaurant or supper club. A lot of times they pointed me to gas stations. In our smaller communities around the state, oftentimes it's the gas station at dawn where you go to get the news. Typically these are groups of people who were on their way to work in the morning or they were retirees. Oh, and that loon is just because there's a lot of great fiberglass art in this state because there's an awesome fiberglass factory in Sparta, Wisconsin. And so many of you I'm sure are familiar with large muskies and bears and loons and such around the state. But anyway, I throw that in there just for a little bit of color. But once people had said, you should go to the gas station at dawn, that's where people hang out, that's where I would go. And these were people, like I said, on their way to work or retirees, typically men, middle-aged or older white men were the typical folks that I talked with. But in each of these groups, usually it was a mix of men and women, and usually a mix of people who were working and retired. I spent time in suburban areas and in our larger cities in the first year of my field work, but as time went on, I became more and more interested about what I was hearing in the rural places. So these groups I would go back to roughly once a year, but it varied depending on election campaigns and such. Some of the groups I've been back to 6 or 7 or 8 times now, and about a year into my field work, in that first year, I went to most of the groups 2 or 3 times. What I was hearing in the smaller communities really surprised me and worried me, and that's what I'm going to describe for the next bit of this webinar. So what I heard was when I walked into these groups, what I would do is say, I'm Kathy. Hi, I'm Kathy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Do you mind if I join you this morning? And they would laugh and look at me like I was clearly off my rocker, and then say something kind like, sure, we've got nothing better to do. Sit down. And then I would say, here's a pen or a pad of Post-it notes or a football schedule from the university, just a small token of my appreciation for your time. And do you mind if I turn on my recorder? And here's my business card so you know who I am and how to contact me. And then I'd say, what are the big concerns around here? Tell me, what are you all talking about these days? And then they would tell me, and they had plenty to say. And when they described what their concerns were, oftentimes they used this map of the state of Wisconsin to explain things to me, in which, and now this is primarily coming from our smaller communities or our rural communities, people would say, look, there's Madison and Milwaukee, and then there's the rest of us, which you all sometimes call outstate, which is pretty not a term we love, they would tell me. And sometimes they referred to Madison and Milwaukee as the M&Ms. And they basically said, look, there's Madison and Milwaukee, but then there's the rest of us. And just a reminder, here's a map of the state of Wisconsin. If you look at Madison and Milwaukee, they really occupy a pretty small part of the state. There's a lot of other geography out there, and people in that other geography were mindful of the way in which we we generally tend to talk about and think about Wisconsin as Madison and Milwaukee, or centered on Madison and Milwaukee. So that was part of what I was hearing in the rural communities. But overall, I was hearing a more general resentment in which people were saying to me, look, we are not getting our fair share. We're not getting our fair share in the following ways. One thing that they would say to me is, we're not getting our fair share of power or attention. And the way this came out was in people saying to me, look, all the decisions are made in Madison or Milwaukee, never out here. People don't listen to what we're thinking or what our concerns are. And we feel as though we're overlooked or ignored. And so in that way, they were saying, we don't feel like we're getting our fair share. They were also saying to me, though, we don't feel like we get our fair share of money. We feel as though we pay very high taxes, and it seems to us that Madison pulls in our tax money and spends it on itself or on Milwaukee, and we don't see that money in return. So they were saying we're not getting our fair share of power, of money, and we're not getting our fair share of respect, which honestly, in light of the 2016 presidential campaign, I think may be the most important part of this resentment. Because what people were saying to me was, those people making decisions that affect our lives, whether in government, the healthcare industry, or what have you, they don't seem to know us. They don't have familiarity with what it's like to live in a rural community. They don't understand us. They don't understand our values. And it sure seems like they don't even respect us. They think we're uneducated, unsophisticated, and racist, and so on. And in all of these ways, they were saying to me, we're not getting our fair share. We're systematically at the short end of the stick. So this is what I mean by rural consciousness, which is basically just this identity as a rural person combined with these notions that we're not getting our fair share, notions of distributive injustice. This identity as a rural person that is not a label that folks use. They're not saying, I identify as a rural Wisconsinite. Instead, it comes across as them saying things like people around here, or people like us, or people in this town, things like that. In various ways, people communicate their identity with the place in which they live. And again, just briefly, this distributive injustice I'm talking about is this sense of not getting their fair share of power, of money or resources, and of respect. And that together is what I mean by resentment. This sense, this slow boiling feeling of being ignored and disrespected and overlooked. And to me, it's very powerful because there are so many layers to it. They're telling me that they resent cities and city people, but in these conversations, they're also saying that they're resentful toward elites or people making decisions or people who hold power in a variety of sectors of life. They're also saying that they resent the Democratic Party a lot of times and feeling as though they're condescended to by the Democratic Party. And also, they're also talking about racial and ethnic minorities. There's an element of racism here that we need to pay careful attention to. And I leave it until this point in my webinar so that you hear all of the other things that are in these sentiments and still recognize that race and racism are important here. And one of the ways in which we can see this most clearly is that when people are talking about not getting their fair share, oftentimes they're making assessments of who is deserving in the population. And they're communicating that they feel as though they work hard and they're very deserving and they don't seem to be getting what they deserve. And there's a perception that there seem to be other social groups in the population that are getting more than their fair share, getting more than they deserve. And these notions of hard work are very much related to notions of deservingness. Oftentimes when people are making assessments of who is deserving, it's partly an assessment about who is working hard. And unfortunately, racial stereotypes are a part of that conversation. And people's notions of who does and doesn't work hard in the population, oftentimes race is an undertone to those conversations. It's also noticed, though, an undertone to conversations about people's perceptions of who it is in the cities, who lives in the cities. So sometimes racial minorities, but also professional workers who in their mind are sitting behind desks all day, showering before work instead of after. I mean, you have to imagine me driving around the state in my Volkswagen Jetta, a university professor. I'm a social scientist, and people are wondering, what it is that I do for a living. How is it that I am able to drive around the state and have coffee with people, right? And sometimes they would ask me, so Kathy, when do you take a shower? And I would say, well, I shower before I go to work. And then they'd say, see? And it was a little, I was confused the first time I heard this kind of conversation. But then they explained, look, I work so hard that the first thing I have to do when I get home is take a shower. So I can explain this to you for hours and hours, but there's no better way to understand what this sounded like than to hear it in their own words. So I'm going to read to you briefly a few of the conversations through which you can see this kind of racial resentment at work. The first example I want to give to you is of a group of women who meet every morning. I'm sorry, not every morning, but once a week, mid-morning on a weekday. And when I first met them, they were meeting in a back room of a restaurant, and now they meet in the basement of a church. And this group meets in the far northwest corner of the state. It's just women, some business owners, some women still working, some retirees. It's quite a mix of people. Some people live there year-round. Some people live there only in the summer, and they are quite a mix politically. And in this conversation, this took place years ago, 2008, I am asking these folks how they feel about the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Teresa says to me, well, as a former educator, I resented highly comments such as, there's no education north of Highway 8. Highway 8 is a highway in Wisconsin that cuts east-west across the state, about the northern third. She says, we send them, she's talking about the kids in their schools, their public schools up there. We send them such absolutely excellent and well-prepared students there that the attitude that we are the hick area of the state, it was painful. And I asked her, so who did you get that from? From recruiters? And she said, from professors. And I said, really? When they would visit? And she said, yeah, or publish in newspaper articles or other, and that was a little distressful because I think northern Wisconsin feels a little far away from Madison anyway. And we keep waving our hands and saying, yoo-hoo, there's another half of a state up here. Up north is not Wausau. And I'll admit, the first time I heard that, I was a little shocked because I grew up in Grafton, which is just 20 miles north of Milwaukee, and we had always talked about Wausau as being up north. Here's another example. This is a group of men and women that meet in the basement of a church in a tiny town in central west Wisconsin, and the basement of the church is really the only meeting place. So most of the people belong to the congregation, but many of them don't. It's a mix of farmers, stay-at-home moms, business owners, some retirees. It's just a gathering that people in the area know about, so they get together once a week to share the news. And I'm asking again, what do you think about the University of Wisconsin-Madison? What do you think it does not do so well? We've already been through, I should say, as an aside, what the university does do well, and people had plenty of things to say. But when I asked, what do you think the University of Wisconsin-Madison does not do well? Martha said, well, represents our area. I mean, we're like strange to Madison. They want us to do everything for Madison's laws and the way they do things, but we totally live differently than the city people live. So they need to think more rural instead of all this city area. And her friend Donna says, we can't afford to educate our children like they can in the cities. It's as simple as that. We don't have the advantages. Ethel says, all the things they do based on Madison and Milwaukee, never us. Martha says, yeah, we don't have the advantages that they give their local people there, I think, a lot of times. And it's probably because they don't understand how rural people live and what we deal with in our problems. One final conversation is intended to make you laugh, and this is maybe one of my favorite conversations in my whole travels, but this is from a group of folks who meet in central Wisconsin in one of the lowest income counties in the state. And this is a group of men, only men and me, who get together every weekday morning. And I had a difficult time finding a group in this town until someone told me about this group. This is a group of people who get together to play dice every weekday morning. And so I'm playing dice with them on this day, and I've known them about 3 years at this point. And there's also a horse auction going on in town, and they're asking me about the horse auction. They say, Henry says to me, "Why don't you buy one of them horses? I got a trailer." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him, because they know I live basically right in Madison. I hardly have a yard, much less place for a horse." And Henry says, "Huh?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him." And Henry says, "Oh, you keep him in Madison. That's where they keep all the bullshit." And so we laugh, and he goes on. He says, "Well, basically, all you got to do is buy the front end of the horse. They got the back end in Madison." So that was all very funny. But the problem was I'm playing dice with them this time and winning and winning and winning. And like I said, I've known them about 3 years, and I know full well at this point that there's this perception out there that all you Madisonians, you come in and take our money and leave with it, and we never see it in return. So I'm super uncomfortable. I'm joking along with them to try to make myself feel better, I guess. So I say, "Well, I come and I ask for your thoughts and I take your money." And Richard says, "Oh, I tell you what, that's good though, because we have so little of it here." And I say, "Well, it all goes to Madison anyway, right? Ha ha ha," trying to lighten the mood a little. And Howard says, "Well, we expect nothing less from Madison." And Richard says, "Well, at least it won't cost any postage to get it down there now." So I give that last conversation to you to just let you know that a lot of times what I was hearing was pretty sobering to someone who knew and thought I knew the state and loved the state dearly and grew up in it and chose to work here for my entire career so far. And at the same time, often when people were telling me about their resentment, they were saying it in a pretty kind, funny, and delightful manner. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So, why does this all matter? It matters because this perception of not getting one's fair share, whether they're feeling it in a lighthearted mood or not, it makes very fertile ground for some pretty divisive messages to take hold. Here's what I mean. Back to this notion of hard work and deservingness. If you're perceiving that you're not getting your fair share, there's a lot of room for people for someone, a political entrepreneur, someone who sees some gain to be made by tapping into that sentiment by saying, "You're right. You're not getting what you deserve," and offering up a target of blame for people to latch onto. It's also fertile ground for divisive messages because part of what's going on here is a kind of awareness of a threat to one's social status, whether it's status as a member of a community or more broadly in terms of status as say a white person in Wisconsin. This notion that the world is changing quickly around me and my community used to be thriving and it no longer is, and there seems to have been some force or some body, something that has taken away that good life that we used to have. Again, that makes room for someone to come in and say, "You're right. It has been taken away, and here or here is the thing, the person, the group that you should blame." And finally, it also makes room for a call for a pretty massive change in government, because what people were saying to me was, whatever government is doing, it is not working for people like us. Look around us, Kathy. They would say, just look out that window and tell us that whatever government program is in place is benefiting people in this town. Oftentimes people had this sense that government was an urban entity, even though on average 10% of all workers in Wisconsin communities are employed by a government. People have a sense that the way those government workers do their jobs is determined by urban values. They're determined by urban values, meaning For example, people in the public schools, there was a sense that the way public schools are run is dictated in part by decisions made in Madison. And they were also saying that, it doesn't seem, whatever government's doing, it doesn't seem to be working for people like us. And they were also perceiving that those government decisions were being made by people who don't respect people like them. I want to note that these views were in place before the Great Recession. I started my fieldwork in 2007 and heard these things then. And it's helpful to keep in mind that this isn't new. It wasn't new in 2007. But there's something about the context in which we live right now that makes these views especially potent for politics, whether it's what our politicians are doing or the various things that are coming together, the Great Recession, the brain drain or the loss of young people from these communities, changes in agriculture, changes in the global economy. All of these things are coming together. And so Wisconsin, basically, I wrote my book about Wisconsin thinking that something special had happened in Wisconsin and it was worth paying attention to. And in many ways, in retrospect, we were a bellwether state. So when Governor Scott Walker was elected in 2010, shortly after he took office, he proposed legislation we know as Act 10, right, which is the legislation that eliminated most collective bargaining for most public employee unions. And if you lived in Madison at the time, this might be kind of a visual you have about the response to Act 10, that many people thought it was the most horrendous piece of legislation ever proposed to mankind, right, or personkind, I should say. But if you drove not that far out of Madison, what you might have heard were people saying things like, it's about time. It's about time. Here's one way in which that came across. People would be saying to me, look, Kathy, they're asking us to pay higher taxes so that we can pay for public employees' pensions and health care. How is that fair? We're working our rears off to make ends meet, and we can't even afford health care for ourselves or for our families. So again, it's about time. People had this sense, this feeling of things are out of whack, and some people are getting way more than they deserve, and we're not getting as much as we deserve. There were other ways in which we could see the rural versus urban divide in Wisconsin politics. I'll just give you one example from the 2010 gubernatorial race, the way in which Scott Walker has really resonated with the rural resentment that I've heard. And he's tapped into this feeling that, too much goes to Madison and Milwaukee. Too much money, too much attention, maybe too much respect. And the way that I saw it most clearly was in the way he talked about the high-speed train line that was proposed between Madison and Milwaukee. It was an issue that was in the 2010 gubernatorial race. If you may remember that at the time in that race, the incumbent governor, a Democrat, Jim Doyle, had accepted and applied for and accepted this federal money, $810 million in federal funds to build this high-speed train line. And Walker had pledged that if he were elected governor, he would not take that money. And here's what he said about it in the 2010 gubernatorial primary, in the first debate in the primary. He said, if you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett, who was eventually Walker's Democratic opponent in the race, if you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett have put on the table in spending $810 million on a high-speed train line between Milwaukee and Madison, with no assurance that it will go to Eau Claire or La Crosse or anywhere else, it's just about those two areas. And it's about taking that money that will cost the citizens of Wisconsin up to $10 million per year, according to their numbers. I think it will actually be much more. That's $10 million that doesn't go to fix the road that goes up from West Salem through the cutout up to Black River Falls. It doesn't fix streets in La Crosse. That's money that's taken away from our local roads and our bridges and our other transportation needs today. So in the way he talked about that issue, there was this clear dividing of us in Wisconsin and them in those two areas. And his use of the word our in that last phrase, our local roads and our local bridges, made it clear about where he stood with respect to that divide. And then we have the 2016 presidential election, which I'll just touch on momentarily here. because probably the reason you're hearing my voice today is because it was after the 2016 presidential election when many people turned to me not just to understand what was going on in Wisconsin, but what was going on in our smaller communities across the country more broadly. And oftentimes what people are asking me is, what is the deal? How is it that people could vote for Donald Trump? And I hope that what I've explained so far can help people understand why it might be the case that someone might vote for Donald Trump even when they say things like, we don't like his Twitter behavior, we don't like this thing that he said, or this type of thing that he did. But instead they were, many people that I spent time with in the field were very much hoping that, yes, he would come in and drain the swamp and do something drastically different in Washington, D.C., that he would be a different type of politician. But more specifically, here's how I saw this playing out in my fieldwork in the past few years. That, again, Donald Trump, in the way he conducted his campaign, was clearly pledging to come into Washington, D.C. and be a very different type of politician and overturn politics as usual overnight. And that was appealing to a lot of folks who felt like, whatever government is doing is not paying attention to people like us. And also, it is very important, I think, that Donald Trump's opponent was Hillary Clinton, who to many people was both very unpopular at the beginning of my fieldwork and well before that, just someone that they did not have a great deal of respect for. And yes, oftentimes in these conversations, there was a pretty apparent sexist element to the way they would describe her. But another important part of her candidacy is that she represented to a lot of people typical DC politics, and this idea that she had been in DC politics for 3 decades or so did not sit well with a lot of folks. But then another really important part of what has been revealed to me, at least since the 2016 presidential campaign, is just how powerful an element in the politics of resentment it is, the notion of a racialized us versus them. And we can start with birtherism, as uncomfortable as it is, but I probably don't need to remind you that Donald Trump is the person who promoted this idea that Barack Obama was not actually a U.S. citizen, and so gained a lot of attention for his claims that our sitting president didn't have a right to be president. There were other things that came up in the campaign, too, that were clearly about saying, you're right to be so upset, and kind of holding up a particular target for people to blame. The notion of building a wall and the anti-immigrant rhetoric is probably the most prominent. But then in recent months, the Muslim ban, Muslim travel ban, and also the ban against transgendered people serving in the U.S. military are other cases in point of generating support for policies or motivating policies by carving up the country into different social groups and blaming hardship on some of them. So all of that I recognize is really uncomfortable, and I dwell on it a bit here in combination with the rural versus urban divide, because in many of the conversations that I listen to, spending time in our smaller communities around the state, race was not a part of those conversations. And the KKK, for example, never came up. But what was a part of the conversations were sort of more sort of delicate ways of talking about us versus them, of deservingness, of those people in the cities, of what is wrong and what is right, with the country in ways that race was apparent in these conversations, even when people were not naming specific racial or ethnic minority groups. The notion of making America great again is another way in which Donald Trump tapped into both economic and cultural anxiety. He was suggesting to people, yes, there was a time when things were better in this country, and I'm going to help take us back to that time. And so I briefly want to show you just the results of the 2016 presidential election. Just briefly, this helps. The blue parts are counties that went for the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, and the red counties went for Donald Trump. And if you're familiar with the United States map, you know that most of the blue areas are more urban areas. And finally, this is just a map that shows the greater allegiance with the Republican Party in rural areas over time between 1996 and 2016. The more red, the more change toward the Republican Party. And I show that to say that these are not dynamics that are new to 2016. This has been something that's been going on for several decades now. And then I wanted to touch on briefly this question of the things that I'm hearing in our rural communities. Are these claims legitimate? In particular, are the claims that we're not getting our fair share of resources legitimate? And what I'd like to show you are a series of dot plots, or scatter plots, that demonstrate that if you're looking at, on a per capita basis, how much money people in rural counties in Wisconsin pay into taxes and how much they get back from public dollars, it's not necessarily the case that rural communities are getting less than their fair share. So for example, this is with respect to state dollars, and the lines are pretty similar with respect to federal, that the rural counties are the ones over on the right side of the graph, and if anything, they're getting a little bit more per capita, and these are according to 2010 dollars. This is how much the previous graph, was how much people were paying in. This is how much people are getting back. And if you combine those two into a kind of fair share calculation, if anything, on a per capita basis, people in our rural counties are getting a little bit more than their fair share of state dollars. And the same holds true for federal dollars too. We could stop there, but that doesn't fully capture what's going on in these communities. And basically what I'm trying to show here is that these concerns, a lot of it is rooted in actual challenges that these folks are facing, which we need to acknowledge. So median household income in our rural counties is lower. The percentage of people living below the poverty line, if anything, is higher in our rural counties, and the unemployment rate is higher in our rural counties. If you look nationally, a similar story holds with respect to unemployment. This is a chart that shows you recovery since the Great Recession, and in metro counties, metro communities, we seem to have surpassed the employment rate, but in non-metro counties, we still have not recovered to where we were before the recession in 2008. And here's one more chart, and then I promise this is the last one I'm showing. This just shows broadband coverage across the county. On a very simple level, the blue areas are areas where there's not great internet download access, and the orangish areas are where there is. And you can see that the broadband access is highly correlated with our urban areas. So is it economic anxiety or is it cultural anxiety driving these views? I want to argue strongly that it's both. I've dwelled a little bit on the racial sentiments, but I've also just shown you various ways in which the economy that folks are facing in rural areas, the challenges are pretty tough. But I was reminded of the danger, in a way, of saying it's both by the recent Ta-Nehisi Coates article in The Atlantic. So I want to read to you briefly a quote that I find quite eloquent and was a great reminder and a wake-up call to me. Coates writes this: "The politics of race are themselves never attributable just to the politics of race. The history of slavery is also about the growth of international capitalism. The history of lynching must be seen in light of anxiety over the growing independence of women. The civil rights movement can't be disentangled from the Cold War. Thus, to say that the rise of Donald Trump is about more than race is to make an empty statement, one that is small comfort to the people, Black, Muslim, immigrant, who live under racism's boot. And I do think we need, especially in light of birtherism, we need to keep in mind that these resentments have been politically useful in the wake of our first African American president. That context, I think, is really important here. One other final thought I want to leave you with is just why are we paying so much attention to the white working class these days? And why are we paying so much attention to what folks in rural Wisconsin, rural United States think? On the one hand, personally, obviously, I'm happy. I wrote a book about what people in rural Wisconsin are thinking, and I've been very proud to be able to share what I know with many audiences. And I also think that in many ways, our rural communities have been overlooked and disrespected and ignored, and many of their concerns, I think, are addressable through public policy. And I do believe that people, personally, I do believe that people across the board in a democracy need to have their concerns and their voices recognized and heard. But I am also wondering these days, why all of this attention to members of the white working class when many of these concerns sound a lot like concerns that communities of color have been voicing for decades, if not centuries. And this feeling of not being paid attention to, not getting the basic resources you need in order to get ahead, and not being respected by the people making decisions. That is not unique to people in rural America. And I think knowing the priorities and the concerns of FCI and the FCI community, I know that many of you who are listening today are both concerned about what's going on in rural Wisconsin and the rural US and rural places in many countries around the globe, and at the same time are intensely concerned about racial justice. And I think the two are closely related, and it's worthwhile to think about why, which group is getting our attention, and to try to keep our eyes on the prize of wanting to live in a democracy in which all people are valued and respected. So I leave you with that thought, and I leave you with a whole lot of gratitude for listening to me today and for caring about these issues. We have a lot of work to do, but it's great to be in a community with people who are willing to do it. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for an amazing presentation, very thoughtful. Walking us through your research over the last decade and reflections on what's happened over the last year. And I think sort of also touching on certainly what's important to us here at FCI, looking at racial equity and trying to also fit that conversation into what's going on in the larger state, the country more broadly, and how that fits into thinking about rural areas. We're a statewide organization, and so this is something that we certainly have been grappling with, and just being able to really kind of think about where rural communities are coming from. I think that's tremendously helpful. But then putting it into this larger framing of why, your last question, why are we paying so much attention to the white working class and the plight of the white working class? Yeah. I think it's really, really important. I invite all of you who are listening, participating in the webinar to please go ahead and submit any questions. We have a few more minutes here with Kathy, so if there are any questions, please go ahead and submit those through the chat box. But if I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about this last point, because it's, in fact, it's something that we've, like I said, we've been grappling with. Recently heard that Ta-Nehisi Coates, there was an interview, and he was kind of speaking to this, and I just think it's really important for us to be thinking about these days. So
yeah, well, I'll say, I mean, I don't have it figured out. I mean, in terms of how do we acknowledge what's going on in our rural communities and the real challenges that folks living in our rural places are facing, and at the same time not lose sight of the fact that all of this is happening in this broader context. Our broader political culture in the United States is one in which we have never dealt with our racial divides sufficiently. That's a vast understatement, right? But the way I think about it is partly everything I'm talking about is about attitudes about redistribution and the role that the government should play and how involved government should be in our lives. And when I think about how that conversation has gone over the course of the United States, we've always had this wariness of government, right? And yet not. There's been certain ways in which we have almost universally agreed that government involvement in our lives is a good thing. Public education, Social Security, broadly popular, right? But when we think back to when the federal government became large enough to actually reallocate resources in a way that was, visible shortly after the Civil War, when the federal government had just freed the slaves and had grown exponentially for the war effort, and suddenly it had the ability to really make a difference with respect to taxation and redistributing resources. And it race quickly became a part of that discussion, where we had very low-income white farmers and newly freed slaves who had many concerns in common, and you can imagine them collaborating politically to advocate for what they needed. But folks who did not want to see that happen were quick to remind whites that why would they ever want to be in collaboration with these newly freed slaves, and that those were blacks, and using every racial epithet to try to prevent people from seeing common ground there. And that the use of racism for political purposes has not gone away. And so at the same time, I really offer it as a question: why are we paying so much attention to the white working class? Ta-Nehisi Coates has a very eloquent statement of, we're paying attention because of white supremacy. And once again, like, the conversation has turned away from people of color to white folks. That's a pretty potent statement. Even if that's not the case, I think it's still, for me personally, I have to ask myself, why are we focusing on particular population groups and not the way in which the system is not working for so many different people? It seems like there's some kind of distraction going on.
Thank you. We've got a few questions in a couple of minutes, so if you don't mind, we'll keep rolling on here. Yeah, really challenging topics. So there's one question about the age diversity among the people you were talking to, if there was much age diversity, and if so, if you noticed any differences across the various age groups.
Yeah.
And if you might be able to speak to that.
Sure. So not a lot of age diversity. It is a great open question of what are younger people in these communities saying. So most of the people that I spent time with were 50 and older, that's not always the case. As time went on, when I knew that I was not spending much time at all with people in their 20s and 30s, I sought out younger groups of people, and a couple of things happened. One was when I asked people in smaller communities, where should I go to hang out with people in their 20s and 30s? Where do they go to gather? And people looked at me like I was nuts and asked if I was actually from Wisconsin, and didn't I know that the tavern is obviously where I ought to go. Well, I just, as a woman traveling on my own, I felt pretty uncomfortable the few times I attempted doing that. I mean, I didn't get much farther than the parking lot, to be honest, like thinking, how's this going to walk in? I'm going to sit down at the bar and say, hi, I'm Kathy from Madison. Do you mind if I join you this evening? So it would have been fine probably, but I chickened out. So instead what I did was spend time with 4 age groups, and it's not necessarily a great comparison, but the honest answer is I don't know. And it's a really great question of what is going on in the minds of people who decide to stay in these communities and try to make a go of it, because we do know in certain places that is happening. And what's going on in the minds of people who want to stay and can't find the jobs in order to stay. Good question.
Another question we got is about rural residents in Wisconsin are generally getting more per capita than urban residents. That said, rural schools are not getting enough money. Infrastructure and operational costs are far higher than urban areas. There also seems to be an ever-present medical threat. They're closing clinics, hospitals, and the distances to get to them are very, very, very far.
Yep.
So do you have enough data to measure what risks are most urgent to rural folks? Yeah. Who's addressing these kinds of issues for them?
Well, those are great questions. And the first part of the question is a great reminder that even if rural communities are getting slightly more per capita, economies of scale are such that rural communities still can't quite provide the services that urban communities do on that allocation. And healthcare is definitely a great case in point. So my data speak to what people perceive to be the greatest risks to their well-being, and not necessarily if you can objectively measure what are the greatest risks. But thankfully, there are. Many of you are probably sensing this, but there are a lot of, in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, there are many organizations that are concerned about well-being in rural areas and are trying to find a way to enable people in rural communities to thrive, whether it's through, job, entrepreneurship, or healthcare, or public education. So it's hard for me to say which is the greatest risk. But healthcare and education and jobs, they're all related, and they're all certainly right there at the top.
Thank you. We'll go for one more question. And it has to do with whether there's a difference between voting rates of white rural populations and more urban populations.
So rates in terms of who turns out, on generally the white urban residents, kind of depends if we're talking about urban or suburban, but would turn out at higher rates than rural folks. And it's very difficult to determine whether that's because of where they live. There's something about living in a rural place that means that you're going to turn out at a lower rate, or if it's because on average rural folks have lower income, lower levels of education. Those two things alone are really strong predictors of who turns out to vote. Some people also make an argument that it's about the level of kind of excitement around elections. In urban areas, you tend to get candidate visits and a little bit more of a buzz around an election. Rural areas, again, this is one of the ways in which people feel passed over or looked over or ignored, and that very rarely does a presidential candidate, for example, come to your town or near your town. So on average, urban white folks would turn out higher.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Kathy, for
Welcome.
being here with us today, sharing all of your research and insights. I want to also remind people that we recorded this today, so it will make available the link to you in the next couple of days. We'd like to thank BMO Harris for sponsoring this webinar series, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.